Good morning. I'm going to call to order this budget kickoff meeting of the Board of County Commissioners and our leadership team. Thanks for being here, everyone. I'm Lori Trieger, Chair of the Lane County Board of Commissioners, and we'll just do a lightning round of introductions to ground us in who all's at the table this morning, but also for anyone watching, we have several folks in the audience with us from the team. So let's start to my right with our Vice Chair this morning.
Good morning, everyone. Vice Chair David Lovell, glad to be here.
Heather Buck, Lane County Commissioner for District 5.
Ryan Sinnega, County Commissioner.
Greg Rickoff, Assistant County Administrator.
Steve Mokrahysky, County Administrator.
Christine Moody, Budget Manager.
Steve Adams, Policy Director.
Cliff Harold, Sheriff.
Patty Perlow, DA.
Mike Finch, Chief Information Officer.
Lauren Blythe, Director of Operations.
Alana Holmes, Chief Human Resources Officer.
Eve Gray, Director of Health and Human Services.
Dan Hurley, Public Works Director.
Pat Farr, Board of County Commissioners. I represent Bethel and other parts of West Lane County. And pardon me, Chair, but Dr. Greg Nelson, who's going to be on our Budget Committee, this is his first meeting here. Dr. Nelson will be joining us.
Welcome. Thank you. So we are going to start this morning with an overview from our Chief Budget Officer, which in our case is our County Administrator, Steve Mokrahysky. And I will turn it over to Steve for a presentation. Thank you and good morning.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. Good morning, Commissioners, and to our Lane County leadership team and staff and residents and others who have joined us here this morning. It is the second week of January, so we know it's budget kickoff time, and we're pleased to be here with you this morning. We have, as you can see, a lengthy agenda and several speakers, so we'll do our best to work through all these topics, a lot of information to provide to you, but this really is the start of our budget process for next fiscal year. We'll start, just jump in here and walk through the schedule. Sorry for those whose backs are turned here, but this is our schedule. Today is our leadership team meeting. Next week, we will have our department budget kickoff. We'll provide instructions to departments to allow them to develop their requested budget. And the departments then submit their requested budgets by late February. In early March, the departments meet with the county administrator and budget team to go through their requested budgets and talk about what they're looking for. We talk about the challenges that we're having financially within the various funds and how any additional adjustments that need to be made. The county administrator then proposes the budget in late April. The budget committee will meet, typically it's the first Tuesday, I think. First Tuesday. Is that?
This year it will be Thursday.
Oh, it's Thursday. Okay.
Yeah.
The first Thursday in May. It will be the first budget committee meeting. The budget committee will meet for a couple weeks there through mid-May, and then approve the budget by mid-May, and then it will go to the Board of Commissioners for adoption in mid-June. So that's our schedule. I want to just provide you some of these slides for folks who've been around. Will recognize some of this information, but it's always good to be grounded, I think, in sort of the big picture of what we're dealing with. So just to give you a picture of the size of our budget, the number of FTE, and we've grown. Lane County has grown in the past decade fairly significantly. We've had, I think it's a 46%, not quite 50% increase in FTE, which is full-time equivalent positions. So the number of positions, when I started here in Lane County in 2014, we had approximately 1,300 positions. Of course, if you go back to 2012, we had, I think, around 1,500 positions, and that was the big SRS reduction year. We'll show a slide that indicates that big reduction year. Lane County was in the position of eliminating 200 positions, and so our workforce went from around 1,500 down to 1,300, and then we've grown since that period of time. I think what a part of our story is of success. We'll start with a positive note here that we've done a really good job in stabilizing and I will say stopping the bleeding of significant decline in revenues, decline in services and staffing. So we've been able to stabilize in some really core fundamental areas, particularly in public safety and some of those core governmental services. And then we've seen growth in areas primarily where there's been priority from the federal government and the state government in funding. So if you look at our community health centers, we've seen significant growth since the Affordable Care Act was adopted and Medicaid expansion And all of the funding that we've received through Medicaid expansion has allowed us to go from 1 or 2 community health centers to now, looking at Eve, 7 to 8, right? Once we opened the Cottage Grove Clinic.
9 if you include the mobile unit.
And the 9 with the mobile unit. So we just continue to see this incredible expansion of services to the community, which comes with an expansion in positions. The other, so that was a priority, right, from the federal government. They said that we want to expand healthcare access for people across the country, and they provided funding, and we've been able to really take advantage of that opportunity and deliver services to the community as a result of that. Another example is developmental disabilities. The state funding, because the state has so prioritized funding for developmental disability services across Oregon, it's allowed us to continue to expand those services. So we've seen both increases in staffing to deliver developmental disability services, as well as the need for expansion of facilities. We constructed a new facility for our DD team a few years ago. So in those areas, again, where we've seen the federal and state government prioritize services and provide funding, we've seen growth. In other areas that are traditionally funded by local resources, with the exception of the public safety levy that was approved in 2013 and then again in 2018 and then again last year with 80% support, another great bright spot for the organization and for our community. With the exception of the public safety levy that really helped us stabilize correction services on the adult side and to some extent on the youth side, we have seen really flat growth. Some very small. We've seen some positions that we've been able to add through the annual budget process in the district attorney's office. The board was in the last few years able to enhance some funding for public safety services and rural patrol in particular, in a small way, not at the level certainly that is needed, but we've this board, our current sheriff and previous sheriffs and our team have been very focused over several years at one, stabilizing those core public safety services, and then 2, where we have additional resources that we can allocate to try to do that in ways that will significantly improve or at least substantively improve in those areas. So, of course, you know, we have 12 departments. This is all to say we have seen growth. And so it's a difficult message sometimes when we talk about when we have budget challenges and we have shortfalls and we have budget imbalances to go, how is it that we're short, that we don't have the revenue to pay for all of the expenses that we have in all of these areas if we actually have grown? So I just wanted to make it really clear that we have seen growth and that the places that we've grown have been from places where there's dedicated revenue, primarily from the federal and state government, where they prioritize these services, and then we're able to capture that and enhance service levels in the community. That is true, but it is also true that we have some fundamental structural problems with the way that we fund our organization, some of the core elements of this organization. So we'll talk a little bit about that. This slide, I've looked for so many years that this slide is a vertical slide, so now I have to go like this. But we tried to do this. If you remember, the Secretary of State used to do this. I think it was an annual review of counties, and they don't do this anymore, but they used to do this review of tax rates and total revenue, local revenue per capita, and sort of look at the health of counties from a financial standpoint. So this original chart looked different. We wanted to expand it in a more of a horizontal way to make it a little bit easier to read. The point here is to say you're looking at the property tax rates, the permanent rates for the 36 counties in Oregon. And if you start at the small, it's fairly simple to say on the far left are the lowest rates, and on the far right are the highest rates. These are county permanent property tax rates, so they don't include what the cities within these counties, what their rates are, or the school districts, or special districts, fire districts, those things. These are simply the county permanent rates. And so you will see, can you kind of see in the red there, number 7, and we're going to zoom in Lane County is at $1.28. So we're the 7th lowest property tax rate in the state of Oregon. We'll zoom in here and show these are the 5, this is Lane County plus the 5 comparable counties that we typically look to. Our comparable counties being close in likeness, both in population, in service, types of services. So you'll see Deschutes County on the far left, $1.28 rate, same as Lane County's permanent rate, which seems confusing when you think about some of the services that Deschutes County is able to provide. And then you see Lane County at $1.28, Jackson County $2.01, Washington $2.25, Clackamas and Marion at $2.98 and $3.03 respectively. We've talked about this over the years and even recently. Deschutes County has 2 additional permanent rates to fund their public safety system. So they've actually carved out the vast majority of their public safety system, their district attorney's office, their sheriff's office, to some extent parole and probation, 911 services, and maybe some other areas as well. With these 2, a countywide permanent rate of $1.25, and then another rate that is exclusively in the rural areas at $1.55. This is viewed by many folks, particularly in the public safety and law enforcement world, as a dream. One of the ideal models in Oregon, given the constraints of property tax restrictions, to have public safety be able to be funded by a dedicated rate has a lot of benefits, and that's something that we're increasingly having conversations about and engaging our residents in that topic. But it's important to note that while Deschutes County has that $1.28 permanent rate, they have these 2 other permanent rates on top of that fund a whole host. We don't have that. Clackamas County likewise has a 72-cent enhanced law enforcement rate. That's a permanent district rate, and then a split regular rate of $2.41 in the city and $2.98 in the rural areas as well. So you just again get an example there. Jackson County, very different, I would say, in this sets of services and type of county that they have, and then Marion, we oftentimes compare ourselves most closely to, in terms of the sort of population with the large metro, one large metro area, the types of services, a little bit of a historic timber role there, but their rate is more than double our permanent rate. So this is a big part of the story of why every year we have these conversations about both structural imbalance and as well as underfunding of core services that you don't see really at all with our comparable counties. They don't have the level of underfunding of some of those core services that we face, an important thing to keep in mind. The other slide, this will look hopefully familiar to folks. This is another part of the story of Lane County, and this shows the secure rural schools, federal entitlement program funding, going back to, I know this is a little tough to read, if you look all the way on the left side of the chart, it goes back to 2001, too, so it's about 23 years ago. And you can see, the dark green is, help me out, Christine, is that the Forest Service? And they're the two different, the dark green is the road fund, the lighter green, the sort of mid-colored green is the general fund piece, and then the really light shaded piece is inflation adjusted. So if you look back from today at what those resources would have looked like today, just to get a sense of the amount of funding that Lane County once had to provide services, and this just goes back to 2021. And so if you look back, of course, at the history with restrictions on logging on federal lands and what that has done, that then led to this federal entitlement program to help timber counties, both counties and for public safety services and infrastructure and road services, as well as schools, help to fund some of those critical services. But of course, what have we seen historically, typically with these federal entitlement programs, is they continue to decline because there are very few counties across the country that are impacted in the way that we are from this type of funding. And so in Washington, D.C., when the elected officials are prioritizing, this is not at the top of the priority list. And so we've seen what was likely inevitable, this 82% decline to where we are today. So we have seen the last year you see is this current fiscal year, correct? 23-24 on the far right. This is the last year of secure rural schools that we have authorized. There was a 2-year secure rural, 3-year secure rural schools payment that was authorized as part of the ARPA, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act program. That ends this current fiscal year. So we do not have funding going forward. What the county has done, I think wisely, over the last several years is not rely on these secure rural school resources to fund ongoing operations, because we don't know if we're going to receive these resources year to year from the federal government. And so if those resources do arrive, then we've had very intentional conversations about using those resources to support enhancement of services in critical areas. So this is one of the ways in which we've been able to support additional rural patrol in a 5-year, sort of similar to the 5-year levy, by saying let's take some of these federal resources, put them in a fund to be able to support some 5-year enhancement in public safety services. Okay. Please stop me, Chair and Commissioners, if you have questions along the way, but I know again, just feel like this is important to get grounded in some of these fundamental areas. So I want to take a minute and particularly talk about reserves. You're going to hear more about this, but I think reserves, and it's an important discussion as you know, as we talk. The complexity of our budget is a challenging thing to wrap your head around. We have approximately, we talk about our budget as one thing. Right? You saw the number, $1 billion budget. But the budget is actually a collection of 35 different ways in which we organize that money. And there are restrictions on each of those 35 funds. The general fund is the least restricted. It is the one fund, we talk about discretionary general fund, because the board has a lot of discretion in with those funds. That's where the property taxes, the little bit of property tax we receive from the $1.28 rate come is into the general fund. And the other resources that we receive there, the board has wide discretion on how to utilize those resources. The other 34 funds, you don't. There are things like the road fund, and there are very strong restrictions on how those resources can be used. The road fund we call a special revenue fund, right? The revenue comes from some federal, mostly state resources, and they are dedicated by law to be spent in those areas. You can't use them. There's not flexibility in those resources. Then we have enterprise funds. The solid waste fund is an example of that, where we have a fund where we deliver a service. We charge fees, right, to the haulers and to our customers for the use of the solid waste infrastructure that we have. Those fees then pay for that operation. That's an enterprise fund, right? So while we charge those fees and collect that revenue, that is one of our healthier funds. It's in a good, stable position to be able to pay for, to have the revenues necessary to be able to pay for the expenses that we have. But the revenue that we collect there has to be used within that fund, right? It can't be transferred to pay for public safety or other critical needs that we have. And that is really the story of the vast majority of our 35 funds, with the exception of the general fund, is that there are very tight strings attached to those resources. So just want to paint that picture that we have, one budget, you get one document. We talk about, $1 billion budget, but it's a collection of these 35 different funds with various restrictions and requirements on them. Each fund, most of our funds, I should say, have reserves, not all, and we have reserve policies that the board has established. We've established a reserve goal and what the board has done is adopted the GFOA, the Government Finance Officers Association, which is the national association, the sort of standard for how local governments in particular manage their resources. And they have a goal of 2 months, a minimum of 2 months of operating revenues in reserves, which is approximately 16.7%. We round up to 17%. So that is our what we call our 2-month minimum operating revenue for example, in the general fund. We say we need to have 2 months of operating revenue available for cash flow purposes. Prior to that, before the board actually had established that rule, the county had issued tax anticipation notes for cash flow. So we had issued these notes so that, because, revenue arrives at different times, right? We collect property tax certain times of the year, but we have payroll every other week. And so we have to pay our bills and everything. So we were issuing these tax anticipation notes for cash flow, and our general fund reserve level was between 5 and 10%. Think about that, 5-10%, which provided no buffer for unanticipated events and resulted in large budget swings and service reductions or layoffs. So what we've done here with our reserves, so we have a 17% is for the minimum 2-month reserve, and then we do a 3% service stabilization reserve, and then reserves anything above that amount. The board is required by policy to establish specific uses for. So it's just to say that these are very intentional. And again, the general fund is you have the most discretion about how you can use those reserves. We have the largest reserve we have actually is in the road fund. Now this makes sense because the road fund, as opposed to most of our other funds where we primarily, our expenses are people, the road fund primarily our expenses are infrastructure. It's equipment, and it's materials, and it is personnel, but it's primarily, and so having a reserve that is able to fund those ongoing future capital needs for repair of roads and bridges is really important. So you'll see reserve levels look different in different funds depending on what type of fund it is. Solid waste is another example. We have a larger solid waste fund because of equipment and infrastructure and facilities that we're managing. And of course, we know we're managing a landfill for 100 years. So we plan for the future of cell replacement and those types of things. So I know that was a bit of a deep dive, and we certainly could go deeper into that conversation, but I just wanted to paint that picture of how critical reserves have been in stabilizing. And think about it this way from a simplistic standpoint. In each of our personal budgets, we have really core things that we need to pay for. We have our housing expenses, our rent each month that has to be made, and we have food that has to get put on the table, and other transportation expenses and education and childcare and all these different things that people have to pay for. And everyone tries to have something on the side, something to say, something you saved up for in case something goes wrong. And of course, what we don't want to do in our personal budgets is if we don't have enough money coming in to be able to pay the rent, and we start dipping into our savings account, at some point the savings is going to dry up and there's no savings left. And if we haven't addressed our overall income, right, if the rent we have every month exceeds the income that we're bringing in, then we have to dip into our savings account. When the savings goes away, we still have that imbalance. And that's an example of simply the situation that we're dealing with in Lane County in a number of our funds, in particular in the general fund, where the revenues are not matching the expenses. And so we can use reserves, which we've done in this fiscal year, and we likely will need to do next fiscal year when you see the shortfalls that we're looking at. But to rely simply on reserves to fund that difference only pushes the problem down and makes the problem actually bigger. And those reserves will deplete, and we'll be left with the same problem that we had before. Okay, so I'm not going to get into all those other things and just want to talk about a couple other pieces, but we have been very intentional. I think that the success of what we've been able to do with our budget in the last several years is that we've focused on trying to make the adjustments that we need to make to get our expenses as close in line with our revenue so that we don't have to cut services and lay off employees. For 10 years, we have not had to rely on layoffs or major service cuts like the county did back in 2012 when it laid off 200 employees. And that is a continued value that we have to continue to make sure that we have the resources necessary to keep our people working, because the work that's being provided by our employees is critical to the lives in our community. So that is our primary goal here. is to focus our efforts on the limited resources in repairing, stabilizing our budget to allow us to repair the critical services that we need to. Stabilizing the public safety system with targeted investments. I think it's fair to say it's going to be really difficult to make any additional targeted investments in this next year, because our primary focus, as it was last year, for this current fiscal year, and it will be for next year, has been to really try to reduce our expenses in every way possible, see where we can enhance revenues, and not have to rely on reductions in services and staffing. A number of things I know folks are generally familiar with that we've done, we continue to look at. We had a meeting with our leadership team, what is today, Thursday? Yesterday, to talk more. I mean, an hour and a half we spent with most of the folks in this room here, at this table here, talking about what are the different austerity measures that we can invest in, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of those things. But big things that we've focused on in the last several years: moving to a self-funded health insurance program, investing in health and wellness for employees so that we're not just paying for our health insurance costs and saying, well, the bill is what it is. We're actually trying to be proactive at investing in the health and wellness of our employees and also reducing those costs. Because as health insurance and other benefit costs go up, they don't provide an additional value to employees, right? There's no additional, they get the same value, it's just the cost rises. And that, so the more that we can bring our benefit costs down, the more we have the resources necessary to pay for the other things that we want to be able to do. Mainly in terms of our personnel and the other costs related to personnel. So managing our benefit costs, our health insurance costs, our debt. We've done a lot of prepayment of debt, refinancing of debt. The PERS side accounts that we've invested in have been really, these are as much as we can. We're doing what we can. PERS, we don't control the benefit side, but we're trying to do what we can to make the investments necessary to manage that cost, reduce the expenses year over year. Internal services, we have and continue to look at all of our internal services, the levels that they're funded at, the way that we fund them, and make sure that they're at the appropriate level so that we can continue to support, they can continue to support the direct services in the organization, and the direct services can be healthy and well funded as well. Workers' comp liability, budgeting for variances. So we've done a lot, and Christine will talk more about vacancies. Budgeting now for assuming a certain amount. We always try to get this number right. A budget's a plan. So we're simply trying to look at what do we anticipate is going to happen. And so every year we make these adjustments to look at what are the vacancies do we think, because we want the budget number to, right? We don't want to overshoot the budget and we don't want to undershoot the budget. We want it to be right at reality. That's our goal. Another point here I want to make is, revenue is critical. We talked about our property tax rate and the different places, some of the places that our revenue comes from. Some of those things we can control, some of them we cannot. What's important to know about revenue, because as we talk about the budget, and I mentioned this, that we have sort of two challenges with our overall budget, several of our funds. One is it's structurally imbalanced. The general fund and a number of our other funds are structurally imbalanced. The revenues are growing slower than the expenses are growing. That gap is the problem we're trying to fix, right? That's a structural budget problem. That's one. Two is we have these areas that are underfunded. We have services that are not adequate to meet the needs of the community. They're both problems, but they're separate problems, right? And so when we talk about things like enhancing our revenues, whether that's locally or at the state level or the federal, we need to go after more grants. We need to get some more federal funds for, we need to talk to the taxpayers locally about enhancing revenue. All of those things are going to come with additional strength. So we get that revenue, it's going to come with the need for additional expense. So when we think about revenue, yes, we will look at every revenue line item and see where we can capture more revenue wherever possible. But it's important to keep in mind that when we're going after those additional revenues at the state and federal level and even locally, they really are to enhance services, which is a good thing, but that won't fundamentally help us fix the structural problem. Does that make sense? So all of the, you look at the affordable, the American Rescue Plan Act, I think I called it the wrong thing, sorry. ARPA, the opioid settlement, the all-in funding from the state, these are critical resources, but they all come with the need for specific expenditure increases, right? They're not going to fix this structural problem. We are actively pursuing additional potential revenues related to, SRS funding, Measure 110 reform. We know that will come. If we are able to get some reform with Measure 110 that allows those resources to flow more through our local governments and local services, they're going to come with the need for enhanced services. They're not going to help our budget. CDBG grant opportunities, you've heard about some of those things. And of course, Steve Adams, Alex Kyler, the great work that is happening on the state and federal advocacy, but those things, again, will come with strings attached. Rare examples where we receive some additional revenue that's discretionary, state marijuana funds. If there was a small window, a couple years, we received over $1 million in the general fund from state marijuana revenue. And it was discretionary. It really could be used for, however the board deemed it. And then what happened? Measure 110 swept that money. And so that's not to say that's not a bad, that it's a bad thing for the services and the things, but from a budgetary standpoint, that's typically what happens. We may get a revenue from the state, and then if it has some discretion to it, the CAFA funding is maybe another example where, state funding for assessment and taxation was swept. So again, example, Parks Levy is we had an enhanced revenue, came with an enhanced expense.
Steve?
Yeah.
How are we doing for time? Just checking on, just maybe.
We have a couple slides here, and
Great.
then we're going to turn it over to Brian.
Perfect.
So just to, this is countywide, so remember we have 35 different funds, and it sort of depends on the fund that you're looking at. Personnel is more in certain funds than it is in others. Materials and services more in some than others. But as a whole, on the aggregate, 39% personnel costs, 45% material and service, and you'll see a lot of that material and service is in these areas like road fund, solid waste fund, those areas where we have a lot of equipment and materials that are needed. Again, growth in expenses continues. So this is my last slide. Without burying the lead here, this is what we call the JAWS graph, and it's not a good graph. But it does give you the picture, and so here's the number we're looking at, $7 million imbalance in the general fund, structural imbalance in the general fund for next fiscal year. This seems daunting, doesn't it? Because last year when we sat here, we said we had a $7.2 million structural imbalance, and then we made a bunch of adjustments. Health and Human Services, I will say in particular, a number of other things that we did. We made expenditure reductions, and the reduction in Health and Human Services really was a reduction in general fund discretionary support. And so credit to Eve Gray and the HNHS team that was able to do work to make a lot of adjustments to make that necessary. That those same types of approaches are not going to be available every year. But that did help close our gap in about half, from about 7.2 to 3.5, 3.6 million, and then that's what we use reserves generally to close the right. So this feels like one step forward, one step back. It is. But it's just an example, again, of our revenues are growing. They're just not growing at the pace that our expenditures are growing. And of course, the red line, the red line are expenses, and this goes from our base budget in the current year out over a 5-year period of time. So we try to look at this forecast in a 5-year and say what's happening with revenues versus expenses. And that's the picture in the general fund. So that's our task here to begin today. And I want to now take the opportunity to turn it over to Brian Rooney, who is our State of Oregon, from the State of Oregon Employment Department, our regional economist. We always appreciate having Brian come and talk to us about the local economy. So Brian, go ahead and take it away.
All right. Thank you, Steve. Good morning, everyone. As Steve said, I'm Brian Rooney, Regional Labor Economist for the Employment Department. And to advance,
Just a slight click.
okay. Today I'm going to talk about employment and unemployment rates, labor availability, housing affordability, and we have new forecasts that just came out about 2 weeks ago. So employment and unemployment during the ongoing recovery from pandemic recession losses. We're getting to the point where the recovery from the pandemic is fading and we're kind of approaching a new normal. But that'll happen in stages over the next several months, years. So Lane County has yet to reach pre-pandemic employment levels. Lane County lost a little over 26,000 jobs, or 16% of its jobs, in the spring of 2020, and had gained back a little over 21,000 of those jobs, or 81% of what was lost by November 2023. Statewide, Oregon lost 14% in the spring of 2020, so Lane County was hit a little harder. And statewide, we gained back 109% of what was lost by November 2023. Statewide, we topped pre-pandemic levels in January of 2023. If we look at the graph, you can see that after the Great Recession, around 2010, we had rapid growth and easily cleared the pre-recession peak. But then in the spring of 2020, the bottom dropped out. And for 3 years, we had rapid growth. Just beginning at this year, employment growth has leveled off, and for the past few months, it's dropped off. So this is since this is pre-pandemic compared to recent. Some industries have lagged coming out of the pandemic recession. So the goods-producing industries at the top, mining and logging, construction, manufacturing, weren't as affected by the pandemic restrictions. So coming out of the pandemic, they just kind of moved in their structural way and really didn't have a big recovery from the pandemic. As we go down the line, retail trade, that's probably more of a structural change instead of related to the pandemic. With retail trade, we're seeing it's kind of a shift because of people buying things online. So we're seeing a shift of employment from retail trade to transportation and warehousing. Slight shift, but still retail trade is kind of long-term, slow decline. In information, that's almost all the tail end of the LifeLock or Symantec layoffs that were just ending at the beginning of this. Financial activities has done well. That's real estate, property management, insurance has been doing well in there. So professional and business services is down, has lagged coming out of the recession. First of all, call centers are down there. We've seen some outsourcing, and also because a lot of the call centers have people working from home now, the labor force there has been dispersed away from the central location in the county. A lot of those people are now coded as statewide. We really don't know where they're located. And also in professional and business services, we're seeing a little less demand for staffing agencies, staffing firms. And it could be that employers are learning to do recruitment through the internet. They're still large and valuable companies, but we're just seeing a little less demand there. Private education and health services, that's almost all health services. And that's lagged coming out of the recession. There were some labor issues. It took a pretty big hit during the pandemic, and after the pandemic, it was hard to replace a lot of people because of labor issues. Leisure and hospitality, at one point that was above its pre-pandemic level. That's just very volatile and seasonal. I wouldn't worry too much about that. And other services is pretty much the same thing. In government, we've seen growth in local government. The public schools are not quite back, and that includes the University of Oregon, are not quite back to their pre-pandemic levels. They had some labor issues coming out of that. The Knight Science Center is there and is added to local government growth. And non-education local government has grown. As Steve pointed out, there's a lot of money coming down from the federal and state level, and that needs to be enacted at the local level. So we're seeing some employment growth there. this is over the year. So most industries continue to add jobs. Mining and logging has remained stable. Construction has done well over the year. Manufacturing down slightly. And there's professional and business services. That's looking like hopefully a short-term structural change. But health services has been coming back. They're not back to pre-pandemic levels yet, but are gaining ground. And there's leisure and hospitality has added jobs over the years. Other services, it's a real mishmash. There's everything in there from auto mechanics to hairdressers, religious organizations, your YMCA's in there, and that's been growing. Government has added quite a bit, and that's mostly local education, non-education local government. The federal government and state government have been pretty static over the past year. Total payroll employment is up 3,900 jobs, or 2.4% over the year. So that's fairly rapid growth. The most recent estimates are showing that that's slowed down. So the recovery has been uneven across counties in Oregon. There's not much rhyme or reason here, except that a lot of the rural counties weren't as affected by the pandemic restrictions. So they didn't have so much job loss, and so they could kind of go on in the direction that they were going on before the pandemic recession. But you know, both rural areas and urban areas have slower recoveries. You look at Multnomah County, Lane County, but also some of the rural counties are slow to recover and may actually just be having structural losses. But anyway, the 23 counties that have regained their pandemic recession job losses are there on the right. And it's a real mishmash between urban and rural. So unemployment rates are near record lows. You know, we can see with the graph coming out of the Great Recession, unemployment rates steadily dropped and hit record lows in late 2019 and early 2020. With the pandemic, the unemployment rates skyrocketed and then came down afterwards, matching employment growth. So Lane County's November 2023 rate was 3.8%. That's down from 5.2% in November 22, and down from a high of 14.7% in April 2020. So with that pandemic recession, we saw unemployment rates go from record lows to record highs. Lane County's record low unemployment rate was 3.5%, set in December 2019, and Oregon's statewide rate was 3.6%. Oregon's statewide rate was 3.6% in November, and the U.S. rate was 3.7% in November. So, you know, they're all running pretty close together and all near record lows. Oregon unemployment rates by county. We're starting to get back to a more traditional scenario where rural areas have higher rates, urban areas have lower rates. And that's largely because in urban areas, there are just more jobs, there's more opportunity. So when you lose a job, you're able to find one more quickly. If you lose one in a rural area, it can take longer before you find another job. So we're starting to get back to that. With the pandemic restrictions, it was the opposite. Urban areas had higher rates because they had more pandemic restrictions. Rural areas had lower rates because they had less restrictions. But as I said, we're starting to get back to the more traditional scenario. Crook County had the highest rate at 5.7%, which historically any place is not a very high rate. Wheeler County is kind of interesting. They have the lowest unemployment rate at 2.8%. It's very sparsely populated. I think the population is 1,500, and it's very old. The median age is 56, I think. So a lot of retired people, and there's a lot of self-employment too. So like farms. And they gained 30 jobs over the year. So it doesn't take much to drop the unemployment rate in Wheeler.
Thanks for that point of encouragement, Brian, about being really old after 56.
Well,
All of us on this table are really
for
appreciating
median wage,
that.
that's pretty old.
Oh.
But I hear you. Labor force trends. So these are job vacancies in Lane County, and they come out quarterly. So vacancies are still elevated compared to pre-pandemic levels, but are dropping. These are private sector vacancies. Vacancies are down 28% in the summer of 2023 compared to the summer of 2022. And now we're roughly one vacancy per unemployed person in the summer of 2023. That's down a little bit from the summer of 2022. If we go farther back into 2021, we were looking at 2 vacancies per unemployed person. And in some areas of the country, 2.5 vacancies per unemployed person. And that's where we saw a lot of quits. People were able to get a job, and then, they saw another job, better job, higher pay, or for whatever reason, were able to quit and go on to that other job. Quits are down nationally, and statewide, and likely locally. So the labor market, by this measure, is starting to loosen up a little bit. Hasn't shown up in the unemployment rates yet, but by this measure, it's loosened up a little bit. Can't talk about labor supply without talking about retirements. Between 2016 and 2019, retirements grew very rapidly in Oregon, up by 21%, and then has leveled off, but at a higher level, and we would expect that higher level to continue for a while, kind of as the baby boomers go along and then finally clear out. Lane County's share of workers 55 plus is 25%. That's about the same as statewide. So a quarter of our labor force is going to be retiring in the next 10 to 15 years. And so it's a real challenge replacing the people leaving the labor force because of retirement. Okay, this is employment change by component. There's been a lot of talk about less in-migration into Oregon. And Oregon and Lane County depend on in-migration to grow our labor force. You can see as time goes by, and these are decadal averages except for 21, 22, that's a 2-year average. 23, we don't have the components of change yet. But you can see the natural increase steadily dropped and is now negative. So we're depending on in-migration. In-migration, back in the 90s, we were bringing in about 3,000 people per year. 21 to 2010, the Great Recession was in there. We tend to get less in-migration during recession years, so that's likely why in-migration is down there. It was still up, averaged about 2,000 during that time period. During the 20-teens, that was a recovery people, and again, in-migration was up to about 3,000. More recently, and I got to say, the Census Bureau doesn't have such this is Portland State University data, and there's some discrepancy between Portland State University and the Census Bureau. The Census Bureau has negative migration for Oregon and Lane County, and I think it was especially in 2021. But the Portland State data, though, the yearly average 2021 to 2022, we had in-migration of about 2,000 and population growth of 494. If I remember correctly, I think it was 2021, the Census Bureau had in-migration at like 56, and natural increase was about what we have here, was over 1,000. So we had negative population growth in 2021. In 2023, this is the most recent estimate. We have total population growth of a little over 2,000. I doubt very seriously the natural increases come up very much. If at all, it's probably still negative. If this estimate holds, then we're going to be seeing net migration in Lane County of between that kind of historic 2,000 to 3,000. But this is kind of a wait and see, who's correct, the Census Bureau or Portland State. and see if these population estimates hold up to revisions. We have to talk about remote work. The graph is basically talks to the popularity of remote work. So pre-pandemic, we have about 8% of workers expected to work remotely, 32% hybrid, and these are remote capable employees. So these are people that sit at a computer all day, accountants, economists, the like. So as we go forward, there's more expectation of working remotely or hybrid. And if we get to the preferred location, it's 60% hybrid, 34% remote as a preference. So, you know, if you're capable of having some remote work as an employer, it's a great benefit to attract people. Some people won't take a job unless they can work remotely or hybrid. If we look at the overall workforce before the pandemic, about 5% of people worked remotely. And then the data for 2022 shows working from home. Lane County's at 15%, same as the U.S. Oregon's a little higher at 20%. The Portland metro area has a very high level of people. I think it's around 30% that are working remotely. We have an article about that goes with the graph also if it needs more explanation. So housing affordability. This is becoming more important today. The Consumer Price Index came out, and it remained elevated at 3.4%, ticked up from 3.1% to 3.4% over the year. And the main reason that it's remaining elevated is inflation in shelter. So that's rents, and they use, instead of mortgages, they use homeowners rent equivalent. Anyway, that was up over 6%, while overall inflation is 3.4%. So that's one of the reasons that inflation remains elevated. These are rents. So rent increased after the pandemic restrictions were lifted. So you can see during the pandemic, rents leveled out. And then for the next couple of years, it was almost like making up for lost time. Rents increased rapidly, starting to level off now. And so, you know, we talked about the CPI. Hopefully, shelter costs will at least level off and help bring the CPI down. This is home cost to income ratio. So how many years of annual median income would it take to purchase a home? This is home cost compared to annual median income. And that's why it gives you how many years. If you spent all of your income saving up for a house, how long would it take? So the ratio, if we look, this is most Oregon cities. And you can see Eugene Springfield is kind of middle of the pack there. At the top, we have lifestyle places. People move there for lifestyle. They buy a house. They're able to buy a house. They're not there necessarily for a job. So they buy the house and they make demand for services, which tend to be lower paying jobs, and drive up housing costs. Bend is the highest, Hood River's next. And then we have Grants Pass in Medford. I was talking to a realtor down in Southwest Oregon. He's like, yeah, Californians are still retiring, coming to Oregon and buying a house. And it's similar to the lifestyle. They buy the house and they create demand for services, but they're not really there for a job. So they create demand for low paying jobs. So we have high housing costs and low income. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner Farr has a question.
Tiny quick one. Is that pre-tax or post-tax income?
It's
a big difference there.
Yeah. And it can vary from area to area. So median income is going to be pre-tax. I'm pretty sure.
That's good enough. Thank you.
Yeah. So Eugene, Springfield, Lane County is kind of middle of the pack in Oregon. But if we go on down the line and compare it to the United States, most of Oregon has a higher home cost to income ratio. So housing affordability is a problem in Oregon, and it can limit net migration if people don't think it's affordable to move there to take a job. And elsewhere, we're talking either lower home costs or higher median income. So building permits are down in 2023. In 2021 and 2022, building permits were elevated. And 2023 is year-to-date through November, so you might put another 100 on there or something like that. It'll be elevated. It takes roughly 1,400 units to keep up with population growth. So that's the decadal average of in-migration divided by the average household size. It's a pretty simple calculation, but I think it gives us an idea of what's going on out there. I think that average household size was 2.3. And that 1,400 may have come down because of pandemic and recent population decline. Depends on who's right, Portland State University or the Census Bureau. We're sticking with Portland State University population data on this one. Anyway, we're close to the 1,400, and in 21 and 22, we far exceeded it. Some of that's student housing, but in that student housing, not everybody's a student, so it does help alleviate some of the housing shortage, if you have. And we're definitely doing a lot better than we were coming out of the Great Recession. So forecasts. This first one is from the Office of Economic Analysis. They do short-term forecasting, and a soft landing is their baseline. So a soft landing is when you raise interest rates to bring inflation down. Inflation comes down, and the rise in interest rates doesn't cause a recession. The alternative is kind of a boom-bust thing. This depends largely on what the Federal Reserve does with interest rates going forward. Now, they keep interest rates elevated for too long, it can drive us into recession. They lower interest rates too soon, it can heat up demand in the economy and bring inflation back. So it's a real touch-and-go situation over the next several months. This is Lane County long-term projections. Lane County jobs are projected to increase 10% by 2032, and we're doing these forecasts every year now. And for every year we get beyond the pandemic recession, the 10-year growth rate slows because that recovery employment. Usually after a recession, you get strong employment growth and recovery. That's kind of slowing down. And so this forecast is influenced more by structural growth. And these forecasts are based on expected demand within a labor force restraint. So the first one is health services. A lot of demand for health services, aging and growing population. Leisure and hospitality is the one that probably still has some pandemic recovery going on with it. And then there's structural growth. I mean, it depends on population growth. Also retirements might help leisure and hospitality a little bit, people travel more. Information. Information is a small industry, but there's a lot of tech in there. There's software and data processing in there, so we're expecting a lot of demand for information services. Construction, there's some money in the pipeline for infrastructure and for housing, and also the cost of housing puts some demand for construction growth. Professional and business services beyond call centers and staffing firms, there's a lot of good stuff in there. There's engineering and architectural firms. There's the sciences, R&D in both physical and social sciences. So we're expecting pretty strong demand going on there. So on down the line, I think the main point here is that most industry sectors are expecting growth over the 10-year period. Oregon statewide is expected to increase 10% also by 2032. Okay, so this is occupational projections. And so the larger occupational categories, services, professional related, so on, have the most openings. But what's important here is that the little bars on the outside, the golden bars, are growth openings. And that's what we saw with the industry graph, the previous industry graph, net growth. The replacement openings, blue bars, are replacement openings. And replacement openings can be caused by exits, and that's when somebody leaves the labor force, and that's largely from retirement, and transfers. And that can happen with advancement, when somebody stays in the labor force and they change occupations. That can happen with advancement, and that's related to retirement somewhat. But also when somebody moves on, say you're a waiter or waitress and you finish your degree in economics and you get a job, and so you change occupations, that leaves an opening also. So the point here is that going forward, because of openings and a little bit because of net growth, there's a lot of opportunity for people. If you have the right training, soft skills, there's a lot of opportunity going forward for folks. Here's the contact information. Any questions?
Open it up for questions. I have one just from all the different slides, trying to create a visual in my mind, but tell me if this seems right. And this has historically been true. The largest growth in terms of number of positions are often weighted toward the lower wage positions. Yes. And I think you didn't bring us this time, but sometimes you have, or maybe it's in your newsletter, I see also the relative proportion of jobs that are full-time and benefited versus part-time and not, because that also impacts people's ability to meet their expenses, sort of the predictability of the income and the reliability and the other pressures. So do you have anything just to say generally about that? And am I piecing that together from all the different graphs about the growth relative to wages?
First of all, in most economies, you're going to have a lot of lower paying service and retail jobs, because for every high paying job, you create demand for those lower paying jobs. What we saw with the housing cost to income ratio was that in Oregon, we have people moving here, buying houses, and creating demand for services, and they're not really here for that high-paying job. So it's not necessarily high-paying jobs that are creating demand for those service jobs. It's people moving here for whatever reason, retirement, lifestyle. So we're seeing that happen. We're seeing growth in services, a lot of leisure and hospitality and retail, but maybe not as much as we would like in some of the higher paying industries.
And one other thought, I'm wondering if you're projecting in future years, there might come a time where it's appropriate to have a slide that shows the impact of increasing use of AI and automation. I think particularly about when you talk about call centers, it's getting harder and harder to have county-specific data as there's more remote work.
Yeah.
But also a lot of those jobs are going away. I mean, I know when I try to book a flight, it's all, robo-chat.
Right.
So you don't actually talk to an agent.
Right. In the call centers, and Lane County used to be pretty heavy in call center employment. Right. We're seeing technology take some of those jobs, and then people working from home. AI is an interesting one. I think, just coming up with information is one thing, but if AI can competently start creating its own software, and taking kind of the judgmental jobs away from humans, then that can have a real impact.
Competently is the key word. Commissioner Farr.
Thank you. And this, the first may be, thank you, Chair, maybe a little bit of an adjunct to what the Chair was asking. A sector that we do rely on remarkably a lot is our nonprofit employment. We rely on them in so many different ways to do the work that that is an integral part of our work. These are jobs that really are human labor intensive. I'm not the only one here who worries about the stability of our nonprofit labor force, both the pay of the nonprofit labor force, the lure of moving to better paying jobs, and the difficulty in recruiting and retaining labor. It's not a huge part of the labor force in terms of the dollars because the jobs are so low paid. And I'm not expecting an answer on this right now, but I think it's something that we need to pay even more attention to because there's very rarely is there a meeting that I go to on the boards and commissions that I serve on where it does not come up that our nonprofits, who we rely on intensely, are not able to meet their labor needs. So if you have a response, that's cool, but I don't really expect one at this point in time, but it is something that we need to pay attention to.
Yeah, the nonprofits are very important, especially when it comes to individual services. Yeah. It's something to...
Thank you, and that's kind of a flag up the pole on this end. And a part of that, and a part of the in-migration, we hear anecdote after anecdote how difficult it is to attract educated and trained labor into our market because they can't find a place to live, or it's more expensive than where they're leaving, or they sold their house there and they can't buy one here. Over and over we hear that.
Yeah.
Once again, I don't really know that there's a response that you can provide, but it's another flag up the pole that we talk about all the time is how difficult it is to find housing. And we look at your rental graph, the rental increase graph, that corresponds also to the graph that you showed regarding how long it takes to buy a new home. So thanks for the information. Thank you, Chair, for indulging me in that. But once again, it's kind of flags up the pole, not really requiring answers from you at this point in time.
Right. And housing affordability is obviously a problem in Oregon.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the board? All right.
Thank you. Thanks, Brian. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Always value your insights and presentation and time that you spend with us. We're going to turn now to our state legislative update. Steve Adams, our policy director, is going to take this. Mr. Kyler is in Salem at the moment with legislative days, and so we're going to give you this state and maybe a little bit of a federal update. Go ahead, Steve.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Good morning, Commissioners. A pleasure to be with you. A couple of thoughts, and so state, and I will touch on a little bit of a federal landscape here as well, but specifically we are on the cusp of the short session. They will be convening on the 5th of February, and this is the final interim legislative days ramping up to the short session. We're seeing lots of legislative concepts being introduced this week, and Mr. Kyler does apologize for not being able to join us today. He is indeed monitoring committee activity. So the focal points for the upcoming short session, traditionally short sessions have been budget adjustments and light on policy in the Oregon legislature. And this year is not going to prove typical in that regard. We're going to see a lot of heavy policy issues hitting. So Measure 110, reform continues to be a conversation in Salem. We are very likely to see some specific Measure 110 reform legislation moving forward in the short session, setting the stage for probably bigger and broader reforms in the 2025 long session. So that we're certainly seeing signals there. Governor Kotek is proposing $600 million in ongoing investment on housing. $100 million of that would build on her all-in work from last year and from the long session, with $500 million focusing specifically on housing production. And we are working closely with our cities across Lane County and monitoring that and ensuring that we can see as much of that investment coming to this part of Oregon as we possibly can. Related to 110 and kind of adjunct to 110 work, we continue to see a real focus on behavioral health issues. It remains foremost in the minds of members. And of course, our priority going into this session specifically is Community Corrections Act and public safety funding, and that is following direction from this board. Next year, of course, we will move very quickly through The Constitution limits the duration of the short session, so we will be done no later than the first week of March, and the work will immediately begin to pivot toward getting ready for the 2025 long session. So specifically some of the things that we think, we understand that there will be another transportation package coming up in the 2025 session, and that this would be our first since 2017. If memory serves, we think local emergency management funding will be a topic of conversation, specifically in the 25 session. And then we see lots of kind of ongoing work. Some of the priorities from the 24 session won't be done in 24, obviously, as we move forward. At the federal level, so we're anxiously awaiting congressional action on the fiscal 24 budget. We had a failed procedural vote yesterday in the House of Representatives. We are operating under continuing resolutions right now. It's kind of a laddered continuing resolution. So the current the first step is 119 is the deadline, the 19th of January. The second is 2 weeks after that on the 2nd. We think that it's probably likely that Congress is going to enact another short-term continuing resolution to enable them to get to a fiscal 24 budget. We hope that we can get that done. We have about $2.6 million in congressionally directed spending requests pending in the current appropriations bill, if we can get that to the president's desk. But it is not out of the realm of possibility that we just see a continuing resolution, which means that we would just hold steady from the fiscal 23. We would just hold those funding levels steady through the end of the current fiscal 24. We continue to see, even despite some of the appropriations challenges in the Congress, we continue to see on the agency side the rollout of the what I'm characterizing as an abnormally large volume of grant opportunities at the federal level. Most of these are associated with the investment or the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, or the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the IIJA, and I'll speak a little bit more to that. Despite the challenges with the fiscal 24 budget, the process for getting ready for the fiscal 25 budget, and at the federal level, the federal fiscal year is October 1 to September 30. So fiscal 25 begins on October 1. So we will be ramping up shortly, and in the legislative committee process and future board sessions, we'll be briefing this board on thoughts and getting guidance on congressionally directed spending and other federal opportunities as well. I do want to speak to SRS. The county administrator raised that. So we currently are operating under a 3-year peg back to the 2017 levels for SRS that was included by Senator Wyden in the American Recovery Plan Act, ARPA. That expires, and in fiscal 25, without additional congressional action, we revert back to the old system in which we're just fully operating on remittances from timber activities. So this would kick us back to that fiscal 2016 timeline, and that you can see the level relative to what the administrator included in that previous draft. So Senator Wyden is aware of this. We understand that he's working actively. We have our fingers crossed, and of course, in our United Front trip, this is one of our top priorities as we go into that conversation to make sure that we understand what we can see happening with SRS reauthorization. We are talking closely with our lobbying firm as well. Smith Dawson Andrews, of course, is monitoring this closely for us. Finally, just to kind of flesh out the kinds of money that we're talking about with respect to the Inflation Reduction Act that I spoke of, the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act. So in 2021, Congress passed a $1.2 trillion Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And you see here just kind of by proportion the kind of allocations. That's $111 billion for roads, bridges, major projects on the upper left. $25 billion for airports, $17 billion for ports and waterways. So just kind of a generational investment on infrastructure that has long been deferred at the federal level. We are actively seeking grants right across county government to try to ensure that we're pulling in these resources. We have a charging and fueling infrastructure grant for about $18 million pending with the Federal Highway Administration currently. We're working actively with Director Hurley's team on pulling in RAISE grants for road projects and other kinds of infrastructure to ensure that we can pull some of this money in. And in the resilience bucket, we're looking specifically at trying to address some of the rural infrastructure. For instance, we were able to work with our partners in the Mapleton Water District to secure $3 million for a water storage project out there to alleviate some of the challenges that they have. In addition to IIJA, and I would note we're going into year 3 of 5 of IIJA, so there's still room to run here. Congress passed a $391 billion Inflation Reduction Act in addition. So this was passed in late 22. This is a 10-year bill. It was how you score it is based on a number of different assumptions because it is very rich with tax incentives to try to spur investment. It's hard to know what the uptake is going to be when you're trying to spur that. Here we're seeing a lot of investment in clean energy technologies, EVs, a lot of manufacturing side incentives as well, really trying to bring back to the United States some of the investment that has been flowing off shore for the last couple of decades. This has a provision this is replete with provisions that we're really trying to wrap our heads around. There's one piece here called direct pay that does a clever little thing that enables folks like us, a county government, to file a tax return to then be able to claim tax credits. And because we don't have a tax debt to pay, we're able to receive the tax credits back as a rebate, right, as any business would do. And this enables you to do things like access some of the clean energy and activities that could be really beneficial for our capital projects, right? So we could begin to look at how we could fund some of our building improvements through some clever little projects like this. The other piece that we should speak of is the CHIPS Act. The CHIPS and Science Act was really another kind of industrial policy move by the Congress. Our own senatorial delegation, both Senators Wyden and Merkley, played a big role in this. But this is a $52 billion investment as well. We have Oregon has a huge play in the domestic semiconductor chips manufacturing within the United States, and so we're a pretty important place, and we have seen the legislature likewise put resources forward to kind of complement. But we've already seen a couple of announcements happening. This is driving a level of investment in this particular sector that can produce high-tech jobs, and it is important for us to monitor. So those are just a few of the federal funding opportunities that we're paying very, very close attention to.
Great. Thank you. That's it? That's all? Any questions from the board?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, Steve, that's really great. I think one of the things that kind of excited me was you mentioned that Tax Credit Act. I mean, like, is that almost like the county's filing a tax return when we don't owe any money and they're going to give us some money? Could that be used for, like, our courthouse that we still need or a convention center kind of investment? Is that those kinds of money we could think about?
Well, Chair Trigger, Commissioner or Vice Chair Lovall, we could, yes. We can't build the courthouse in its entirety with this, but we would be looking specifically at tax credits that are now currently available. So this is for the production and investment tax credits. Most of them are associated with different kinds of clean energy investments. One area that you can do this for is charging infrastructure, right? So as we electrify our county's fleet, this this is something that we could actually capture back. So we don't want to be the first local government, and this tax year that's just opening, we're going to see the first filings. I think I'd like to be the 50th local government, as some others figure out how to kind of work out some of the kinks. But yeah, and this is going to be something that is available. This is a 10-year piece of legislation, so we have a few years to kind of kick the tires.
Super.
All right.
Okay.
Actually, just a quick thank you, Chair. Steve, you mentioned earlier regarding on the state level the Governor Kotek's recommitment to housing and what has been the all-in efforts, the MAC efforts in Lane County. We being the people I like to hang out with, love that happened, and really encourage you and Alex to continue to work with the cities, specifically working with the cities because that's where the engines typically are, to ascertain that we get at least our share of those dollars as we have in the past. And we have been one of the best performers on that front in the past. So I think you have a good product to work with as far as Lane County's response. So cheers, thank you.
Commissioner Farr brings up an important point, though, because as I understood what you were saying, I mean, the all-in money and her rededication of even additional resources that is addressing homelessness prevention and services for people who are unhoused and unsheltered. But there's also a new initiative that she's floating for housing production, which is different from the all-in funding, right? Is that the 600 million? So I would echo his comments in the housing production side as far as whatever we can do to advocate for Lane County to secure a proportion to the problem amount of those dollars for our communities.
Indeed, Chair Trieger. So 35 million of the 100 is going to rent assistance, 65 million to ongoing sheltering needs. Of the 500 million, you're seeing dollars for site acquisition, you're seeing site-specific infrastructure investment, and some subsidies, potentially a revolving loan fund that could help with workforce housing associated with that. We have the highest per capita unhoused rate in the state. We certainly believe that an allocation of those resources should reflect that reality, and so that we see the investment of those dollars in the places where, in fact, we are seeing the biggest problems and largest gaps. That certainly will be a focus, and we're shoulder to shoulder with our municipalities on that point, as well as Homes for Good, our housing provider. So we are busy compiling lists as we speak.
And I'm guessing that it's not developed enough to even know the answer to this, but the land acquisition pot of funds and or the revolving loan fund hopefully will be as expansive as possible as far as the type of usage, that is community land trusts versus to secure it for a private public partnership development versus permanent supportive housing. Do we know anything about the direction that's likely to take?
Chair Trieger, it is, we're learning as we go. So we were seeing kind of draft language over the holidays and responding to that. We've kind of provided commentary back. We're awaiting to see the next evolution. Some of the language was pretty drafty early on. What we are hearing, and we had thought maybe it was going to be focused at different points in the housing continuum, it does look like we could potentially have permanent supportive housing projects. The whole continuum could be, we could see some kind of more like cottage clusters and other kinds of units. We could see some stuff like that included. So we want to compile to be able to demonstrate the demand from Florence, all the way up both of our mountain valleys, to show that we have projects in the offing, that we could produce deals, with the appropriate levels of funding, and be able to demonstrate that there's investment wanting here.
Great. Thank you very much.
Okay. Despite my best efforts, Chair, we are ahead of schedule. Thanks to the other speakers and your diligence in managing the meeting. So I want to invite James Trujillo, our Workforce Wellness Manager, to the table. James is going to give you an update on benefit costs and trends. And I'm going to just tee this off a little bit. We showed a slide for context, like why are we talking about benefit costs and trends. You saw that, if you remember the slide I showed earlier that kind of showed as a whole, again, the $1 billion budget, what percentage of that is personnel versus M&S, and we said 40%, which is an average across all of our funds. but actually our personnel costs range anywhere from 40% to 70% of the budget, depending on the fund, right? This is what's so challenging. When we talk about one thing, it's an average, but then if you break it down, so for example, in the general fund, personnel costs are about 73% of the budget. This makes sense, right? Because in the general fund, mostly, as within the H&HS fund, or the Parks Fund, or the Land Management Fund, all distressed, parole and probation, all distressed funds, I will say, the majority of the resources are for personnel, because what we do is deliver services. So we have to pay for people to deliver those services. So it makes sense that that is such a high percentage compared to, for example, the road fund or solid waste fund, where we have more materials and equipment. So we're going to talk about benefits a bit because it is one of the drivers of, when we look at personnel costs make up primarily wages for employees and benefits for employees. And both of those costs are going up. We want to see wages go up, right? Because as wages go up and the more competitive that we can be for our positions in the market, the greater ability we have to recruit and retain talent. And then we want to make these investments in health and wellness and culture in the organization, because that's really what motivates folks, not their compensation. But compensation can impact people's satisfaction in their work in terms of saying, if I can make more money to do the same job somewhere else, I might consider doing that, right? So we want to be competitive within the market. So on the wage side, we don't want to look at cuts in wages, right? That's not something that we're contemplating. We want to continue to see growth on the wage side. On the benefit side, as I mentioned earlier, spoiler alert, and James will show you this, our health insurance costs are going up 12% next year. That's new. We have not seen that level of growth in health insurance benefit costs in the last several years. We've been really successful because of all these intentional, proactive measures James is going to talk about. This is why we got behind the schedule, by the way, because then I talk. But I just want to make this, I think, a really important point, that if our health insurance costs go up 12%, our employees are not receiving 12% more value, right? As great as our health insurance program is and all the work that we're doing to do all these really great things, we're not getting 12% more value out of that, but we are having to take more of our limited resources to put in to that cost to pay for that increase, which then takes resources away from our ability to put into wages or additional services. So that's, part of this, why we've talked for 10 years now about why are we going to self-funded plan? Why do we want to open a wellness clinic? Why do we want to do these incentives and annual biometric screenings and really get employees to be engaged in this work? Because it impacts the health and wellness of our employees, but it also impacts our ability to pay for the things that add more value versus the things that just suck our resources and don't necessarily add more value. So, and on the PERS side, we don't have a lot of control. So I'm going to turn it over to James. I just want to set that context for, one of the drivers of what's impacting our expenses going up faster than revenues, and one of the things we really need to continue to talk about managing effectively.
Thank you, Steve. Good morning, everyone. So just want to note that I just completed my 10th month of service for the county, and I'm happy to be here. So this
said it wouldn't last.
This represents one of my 5 program areas that I'm overseeing. I will do my best to answer any questions that you have, but I may need to come back to you. So I wanted to lead with workforce wellness continues to be the star of our show and what we want to focus on for the county. And really, this is for the 4,400 lives that are tied to our benefits. It's not just our employees, which of course are very important. It's all the dependents that are part of our benefit plans. And we're really trying to focus on whole self wellness. So it's not just physical, it's mental, it's work-life balance, it's meaning and purpose in people's jobs. And so those are all the things we're striving for as we look at wellness programs. And in terms of our benefits, we're driving towards quality of life. And what that means to me is that we're trying to create the best, highest value benefit programs that have this prevention focus, that are fairly priced both for the employee and the employer, and that it's a responsible investment of public funds. Our strategy to date has really been around, to control our costs around this has really been a combination of wellness, our self-insured model to manage our funds, and also a smart health care consumption model, which is really about the high deductible plans. So, as Steve alluded to earlier in his comments, so we work with USI, which is our benefit brokerage organization, and they analyze every year our cost projections based upon really the utilization of our costs. The bottom line when it comes to medical care, health care, it really comes down to the health of your population, and that's why it's so important to focus on wellness for the organization. So, for the current year, USI projected a cost increase of 11%. So far this year, we are seeing that being borne out, unfortunately. And that was based upon what happened in the previous year. For the next year, in 24-25, they're projecting 11.8 or almost a 12% increase. Now, some of you may be wondering, how do we look compared to the general marketplace? So I gathered some quick facts. Mercer Aon and Willis Towers Watson, which are consultancies that focus on total rewards, medical benefit costs, those sorts of things, they reported healthcare costs jumping from 5.4% to 8.5% in 2024. So unfortunately, our trend is actually beating that, and so points to the need for us to continue to work on our strategies. Also wanted to provide you with kind of a 10-year look of what's happened with our medical cost trends. So we went back to 13-14, and I'll note that in 13-14 and 14-15, those are the years that we migrated from fully insured to a self-insured model. We also had a larger population. Homes for Good used to be part of the Lane County benefits portfolio, and they left. So we had some changes there, but you'll notice that over the 10 years, our strategies around self-insured and wellness have actually done a pretty good job for the county. So we had a number of years that were, negative or almost flat. Starting in 2021 and 21-22, we saw more of a normal sort of medical inflation trend. And then starting in the more recent years, we started to get in those double digits, which is where we start to be concerned about our costs. We also took a look at, so the 8-year cost shift is about 40% in terms of cost increases. But I also learned recently from our our budget manager, Christine Moody, that the last time she took a look at our 10-year cost trends, that they actually went up 100%. And so by that measure, that 40% increase, while it's not desirable, is better than where we were previously when we took a hard look at this. Another way of looking at this is the cost per employee per month. So I also provided you with a bit of a look there. So in 15-16, we had around 1,400 people on our plans, and at a cost of $1,286 per employee per month. Now we're closer to that 1,800 mark with the cost of $1,800 per employee per month, just to give you a sense. One thing that I will note about our costs is that our LiveWell Center also has a cost associated with it. It is not incorporated into this. Those costs have grown from about $500,000 a year to a little over $1 million a year, and that's predominantly to manage our Living Center and our clinic. So what are the cost drivers for all of these increases? As I said earlier, medical benefit costs are primarily driven by the health of your population. So unfortunately, in the 22-23 year, we had multiple catastrophic claims. So we had 3 claims that exceeded our $300,000 stop loss amount. So they're actually 2 were in excess of $3 million each. 1 was over $700,000, and we had 28 claims that were over $100,000. So and overall, that's 33% of our overall paid claims were these high cost claims. So that's pretty significant in terms of the amount of higher cost claims. In the 23-24 year, the first few months of the year were actually looking fairly good. Unfortunately, in October and November, we had a number of higher cost claims of over $50,000, which equated to about $10.2 million in claims in those months. So again, nothing over $300,000, but certainly a $50,000 claim is significant. We've also seen increases to our stop-loss insurance because of all of the catastrophic claims that we've had. Our pharmacy costs continue to be significant. Also, you heard earlier in the presentations, medical labor costs have gone up. Many hospitals are passing along those costs to insurers and self-insured programs like us, and so we're bearing the costs of those increased costs. And I'll also note, we do have some very good, robust, and generous benefit plans designs. Yes?
A question of clarification. This is exclusive of any worker comp claims, right? This is just through.
This is just medical,
Thank
yes. We do have these generous plan designs, which we could talk about, how might we put some more guardrails that make sense to help us nudge our population in the right direction and to help us conserve some costs. We do have some good news in the dental arena, so we're flat with both Willamette and with Moda Delta in terms of our dental costs. We do still know that Willamette continues to have ongoing staffing issues, primarily with dentists. They're having a hard time hiring and retaining dentists, unfortunately. We are in conversation with them. We also know that there's opportunities to increase our preventative care with both of those programs. It's an important part of our strategy. Also want to give you some information about Paid Leave Oregon. Paid Leave Oregon has been a significant part of my portfolio this year as it's become been enacted and it's gone live in September. And so just to give you a real brief look at some of the costs associated with it. So we recently, PLO did increase the salary cap for wages that are subject to PLO to $168,000. They were at $132,900, which does represent an embedded rate increase for us for that benefit. Also note that about 6% of the county employee population has taken advantage of the benefit to date, and we have expended about 41% of the total county contributions that we've made to the state pool so far. So again, those are contributions that were made starting in January of 2023, and so they were expended in the first 3 months by this analysis. So we're just looking at September, October, and November for this. We also note that the average state PLO administered organization has about 2.5 FTE devoted to leaves compared to a 0.8 FTE with equivalent PLO administered organizations. And our good faith estimates in terms of our internal administration costs for PLO is around $185K per year. Wanted to share with you some other benefit trends that are in the general marketplace that are things that we're also looking at the county. Most notably, childcare. I think everyone is aware that, Lane County, like many other counties, we are in a childcare desert, and we know that the two primary problems are accessibility and affordability. And so we are trying to tiptoe in with a pilot program to really address accessibility as the first and foremost. And hopefully we may be able to look at the affordability side of that equation at some point. Also note that there's been a lot of conversation across the country and with benefit providers with a drug called GLP-1 drugs. Now, just to be clear, they are glucagon-like peptide-1 receptor agonists. Please don't ask me to say that again. But basically, these are drugs that have been around for a while that are primarily focused on people with severe diabetic conditions to help them manage that condition. They've become more notable because they are expanding in terms of the use of them. And in fact, they have been approved in some cases to help prevent chronic conditions. I'll note that, we continue to monitor this. We are getting pressure to explore these drugs as part of our pharmaceutical offerings. They are extraordinarily costly. And so we want to carefully look at, how do we approach this sort of drug when we want to help people manage chronic conditions and avoid chronic conditions, but we also don't want to get in the space where it's being used for cosmetic reasons. This is the drug that is people talk about using to lose weight quickly. Also wanted to mention mental health benefits continue to be extraordinarily important. And I'll just say that, I don't have a lot of good data to support this, but there's been a lot of stress in people's lives just in general. I mean, just looking at how the world has been, and mental health continues to be extraordinarily important. We have resources both at the Marathon Live Well Center that we offer to employees, and we also want to take a harder look at our employee assistance program to see what we can do to better support employees. People are also very stressed about finances, and so we are looking to enhance our financial wellness programs this year. And flexibility continues to be important, as you've heard from other presenters today as well. I wanted to end on some good news. Our Live Well Center continues to be a fantastic asset for our employees. In the last 9 months, we have improved capacity of use at the Live Well Center from about 50% to 80%. And what that means is that, 9 months ago, only half the appointments were being used, and now we're closer to 80%. And our target is really around 85% capacity, so that's good news. That increased utilization equates to cost savings for us, because every time someone uses the Live Well Center, that's one less claim that's going into our center. So think about urgent care versus the Live Well Center. So there's a good cost savings. In addition to the prevention focus that the Live Well Center has, which equates to long-term savings. Our self-insured strategy, I think, continues to be a good strategy for us to pursue. The smart healthcare consumption, again, those high deductible plans. We do have a significant number of our employees that are choosing that option over other options. We're close to 700 people that have chosen that option now. So that's good news in terms of our managing that first dollar of our healthcare spend. We're exploring childcare options. We've also introduced canine therapy, also a call out to parole and probation, which have taken the lead on this, but the county is looking for ways to do this, and there is scientific evidence that does support that this does reduce people's stress. And we continue to work to cultivate a culture of health and wellness across the county. That's what I have for you.
Great. Any questions?
Thank you, Chair. The Wellness Center, what a great number that is, from 9% to 80%, and we'd like to get to 85%. What if we get better than that? Or do we have the capacity to and you don't need to answer this at this time, but at what point do we need to increase the actual capacity so that more employees beyond the 85% of capacity can?
Sure. The 85% is the target number that Marathon believes that they can reasonably manage and still get other kind of general administrative work done. So we would be looking at increasing staffing, which is something we could potentially do. We have talked about other services that we could look at offering through the Live Well Center. And I think that our strategy has been, we want to make sure it's utilized to its maximum potential. Once it's there, then maybe we can look at what else we could potentially add.
It is a fantastic benefit.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Farr. I just have one question, which might be more for our administrator, probably is, one of the reasons we talk about wanting to have competitive wages and good benefit practices is for employee retention. Mm-hmm. So do you know, we've talked in years past about our turnover rate and how it compares either with our comparator counties or across the state, and if you have any sense of the actual cost associated with turnover.
Yeah, we can, we track those numbers in terms of turnover rate. I always like to look at, particularly on an annual basis, how are we comparing to prior years? And there's usually a story within a year about why we see higher or lower. For example, in 2021, we saw really low turnover, right? Because people were not leaving the workforce. And then in 2022, we saw a bigger increase, which was consistent with the trend. We have historically been below the national average for state and local governments, which is in the 15 to 18%, below 20% is where we always want to be. And so our HR director will get the number for I don't know if we have do we have the number for last calendar year?
I will confirm this, so don't quote me, but I want to say around 11%, which is still pretty good with all the volatility in the labor market. And if you want me to give just a general rule of thumb in the industry for turnover costs, it can be as high as a third the cost of that position. And I'm not including benefits, the total comp, but just the salary. And that's because of the cost for the work being done while that position is empty, the recruitment costs, the interview panel costs, all of the work and the wraparound, the advertising, the outreach. And that's if we're successful with having a candidate that we hire on the first go around. And sometimes in some of our very professional and niche types of positions, we're not able to land someone, and we do have to see multiple recruitments. So that cost, it can vary.
Great, thank you.
Can I just add a comment to that? That really the sweet spot is around 10%. And also remember, we're talking about the aggregate number. So just with the budget, you talk about the aggregate, it's really important to dive into those details, which is what we like to do is go where, on average, 10% turnover is considered a healthy turnover rate for an organization, for a local government organization like ours. When you start taking up into the high teens, that's getting pretty high, right? You need to look at why are so many people turning over. If you get, really low, it's also problematic because you want a certain level of movement to allow for movement within the organization, right? So too high and too low is not good. I would argue 10% is that sweet spot. And then we want to track within certain areas, where is it going higher and where is it going lower and what are the reasons for that?
Great, looks like James wants to interject, and then I'll call on Commissioner Buck and then Commissioner Seneca.
I just wanted to share, I was able to look up the report for the end of the year is 11.9%.
That's what I was going to say.
Oh,
yeah. Sorry. Got it.
Thank
Good
you.
memory.
Commissioner Buck.
Thank you, Chair. I want to personally thank you, Mr. Trujillo, in public for the new child care program that's off and running. And I know you worked very hard on that. And you had mentioned up here exploring child care options, and it sounded like maybe above and beyond the initial program design. And so I was curious what those would be, what possibilities are out there.
Sure. So, we continue to meet with various providers and just talk about various options. I will say that, we continue to get feedback from employees about this option, and the accessibility, I think, is deeply appreciated and the program. But there are concerns about, how do we create something that is affordable for people? And so, are there ways for us to bend the cost curve in terms of our overall benefit projections that could provide some room and space for us to do something to support that for our employees? Exactly what that would look like, I think we're still trying to explore what that might be. But that is the hope, because we know that both of those dimensions are important, and it's a hard situation given our current budget gap that we have right now. And so I'm trying to be very careful about what we might be able to do.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Seneca.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. This might be more for Mr. Adams, actually. Has there been any talk about the possible concerns of PLO? I mean, just looking at those numbers of using 41% of our reserves in the first 3 months it's kind of concerning.
Chair Trieger, Commissioner, there certainly has been ongoing conversation. I think there's been concern about the administrative rollout with the State Employment Department specifically, and I think we've seen legislation being discussed. I'm not aware of anything filed in the current short session. We have, but I will advise that we're literally reading the LCs now. So we've got a long weekend ahead to see what got introduced. I promised Alana and Mr. Trujillo that we would be keeping an eye on this, but I anticipate some legislation in this area, yes.
one other thing that I might throw in there, just when we saw the Affordable Care Act and a number of people who have been uninsured becoming insured, what we saw was massive healthcare costs right at the beginning when people became insured, and then it leveled off. So I think I would wonder if that people were anticipating PLO for a year or more. Were they saving up all their surgeries and time that they needed to take for that initial period? And are we getting through a bolus that will level out? Only time will tell if that will follow the same trend, but I think we should watch for that.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking the opposite is, I mean, that makes sense. But the more people use it, the more people hear about it, the more it gets utilized. But yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
Commissioner Farr.
Thank you. And back to the turnover rate at 11.9%, which seems admirable and close to that sweet spot, Steve, that you're talking about. But I'd like to ask about professionals in particular, because sometimes when we're recruiting professionals who've left, it's more difficult because we have to bring more educated people with different education levels from outside the community. And we've talked about housing as the issue, but we had a period of time in our DA's office, for instance, when we had there's a lot of, I'll call it poaching, that was happening with our trained attorneys, and I think that's leveled off a little bit, but really. I don't know if we need to talk about it at this point in time, but particularly when people were certificated, it's difficult to bring people into the community if they don't already exist here. And so maybe, Patty, is there something that you need to add about that, or I saw you kind of raise your hand a little bit ago. It was, I think maybe you were scratching your nose. I got it.
Commissioner Farr, what happened was the board. I mean, it's a very limited pool for prosecutors. You have to be licensed by the Oregon State Bar. You have to have an interest in criminal prosecution, and my preference would be you have experience in that. And what happened was the board approved salary increases, and other prosecutors from around the state saw the support of this board to my office. And then, to be honest, the legislature approved deputy district attorneys going into the PERS Police and Fire Unit. And so working for a larger organization, one that's supported by the board, became much more attractive. And so I was able to recruit from around the state for experienced prosecutors. And so now we are in a great position, and I thank you for that.
So that's an example of making an adjustment to accommodate an outflow. And Steve, you talked earlier about a smart, no, that's not it. It's health and wellness and culture are motivators in workplace satisfaction and retention. But sometimes compensation is the swing. So an illustration of how it can be addressed on an individualized basis based on the positions.
And I sent out a draft law review article about how this is a problem around the country, that prosecutors are fleeing the profession, and how Lane County was identified in this law review article as a success story.
Thank you.
Great. Anything else before we take a break? Oh.
I just wanted to follow up on the updated number on turnover for the past year, 11.9% for Lane County, as compared to 17.3% in local government through this past November, so 1 month short of the year. So we are, statistically significantly below the local government trend, which I think speaks a lot to the things we've just talked about.
It does. And that goes hand in hand with our healthiest employer, right?
It's an indicator of all the combination of all those things, as the district attorney talked about. Competitiveness within the market for positions is really important, right? If you underpay people for like work within the market, you're going to lose people, right? Your turnover rate is, and that was the case for Lane County for many years, as we were under market in a lot of our areas, and so that has been and continues to be our task, is be competitive within the market for positions, and that's why we focus so much on that end of those discussion around the wage side, and then do these other things around investing in health and wellness and culture and everything that are also really important for creating high performance within organizations. That's research shows that's scientifically proven that that having a healthy culture within a workforce is the thing that actually drives high performance. So those are the things we're all focused on. And now, Chair, I think unless there are more questions, you have an opportunity for a break.
Yeah, I think we can recess for 10 minutes and come back at 10:35. Steve, for the next part of the agenda.
Okay, we gave everyone a break before we dive into PERS. So you have your coffee and snacks there. And I wanted to just say at the beginning of the meeting, I forgot to mention that we have Commissioner Farr mentioned the new Budget Committee member here. I also wanted to call out that we have some representatives from our bargaining units here. So Jen and Larissa are here from our AFSCME, representing our AFSCME bargaining units. I want to welcome them. Also know that there are folks from our other bargaining units that are watching online, and as well as folks from the community and employees. So just want to thank our bargaining unit partners for attending and participating in this discussion. And so now we'll dive into the PERS, and Christine and James are going to take this discussion.
All right, thank you. So as has already been mentioned, speaking about PERS today, because it is a large cost driver for us, and then want to highlight a few places that we've done what we believe we can, because it is an area that's a little more out of our control, potentially even more than health insurance. So just some very high level, since there may well be people watching that are not as familiar with what it is, Public Employee Retirement System. It does have three groups that you sometimes hear referred to based on hire date as a public employee. You could either be in Tier 1, Tier 2, or in OPSRP. PERS employers across the state consist of 897 different employers, and it includes state agencies, universities, community colleges, school districts, cities, and counties. It is primarily a defined benefit plan, meaning that if you meet the certain metrics, you will receive a certain benefit, whereas something like a 401k is a defined contribution plan. So it does have that difference, meaning that there is a pension. So that defined benefit is funded primarily through employer contributions, and most recently what's referred to, and I'm not going to remember what the acronym means, I should have written it down, the EPSA account, where legislation started diverting a portion of a 6% that used to go into an individual account program to go into another employee account that helps fund the pension. And they will do that as long as the system is at a certain funded level. If it ever becomes better funded, they would stop diverting some of that 6%, but they do that right now. So individual account program is another piece where there's what's referred to in statute as an employee contribution, 6%. Of which some of is diverted into that EPSA. But I will tell you that most employers, including Lane County, pay that 6%. So the employer is paying the 6% of the employee contribution. PERS as a whole is a pretty easy formula as far as how you get to how to fund those benefits. You're going to have contributions from employers, employees, and you're going to have investment earnings. And you have to get those two to equal the benefits in order to keep the system funded. I will note that every 2 years, the PERS board adjusts our employer rates. So they do that on the state biennium. So we do get some advisory rates for the off year, just to kind of warn us how things are looking. Lots of times it is a warning, unfortunately. So we have our advisory rates for next year based on the prior year earnings, but they don't adjust them until 2 years later. So a little bit about the funding status, and sometimes you'll hear this, you know, in the Oregonian, we'll print more about the entire PERS system, but the entire PERS system as of December 31st, 2022, which is the latest data from PERS, was 73% funded, but I want to mention the 79% funding because that is when you include side accounts where employers like Lane County have made deposits into accounts to help offset our rate. So it sits a little separate from the rest of our calculations, but they are pulling from the side accounts in order to pay part of our rate for us. And I'll talk a little bit about the side accounts that we have. So the total system unfunded amount, if you just look at the actuary basis on it, if they look out the entire life of it, is about $28 billion or $21.8 billion with the side accounts. Where are the liabilities coming from? This is a big piece of the the equation is that you can see the large piece of that pie over to the right is retirees. So 65% of the liabilities of the PERS system are coming from people who are already retired. Why that's important is there's not a statutory ability to change their benefits. So it's more about and this has gone through court cases and decisions, that you can affect the benefits of the time that hasn't been worked yet, but you cannot affect the time that's already been worked. So Lane County's funding status, we are what's referred to as an independent employer in the PERS system. There's not a lot of us, but it means we're not part of a pool of employers, so we're obviously in the whole PERS system, but our rates are a little more driven on our population, gives us a little more control of things. So our funding status, just back to 2015, I wanted to show you, has stayed. It was in the 70% range. We did reach 80% in 2021. That 2022 data showed us 103% funded. Because at that point we had a pretty new side account. We had just issued a bond in June of 2022 to pay off our unfunded liability. And so I do want to note that even though, yeah, that would be a great number, if we were 100% funded, we at that time had $301 million in debt in order to make that happen. So we have those PERS bonds that we're paying on. So strategies that Lane County has taken to do the things that we can to help control the rising costs is even back in the early 2000s, there were reserve funds. A lot of times that was decided when there were legislative changes that were made that were then being challenged through the courts. And so Lane County would say, you know what, we feel like maybe this court case won't be positive to employers, so we better have a reserve in case it comes back. And so that was the first instance that I see in the history of us having some reserves. Doing that one in particular in the early 2000s allowed us to prepay some of our first bond, the 2002 PERS bond. We paid off one of the years when the court cases did go positively and we had a reserve. We've also issued PERS bonds. So in 2002 was the first time that the county issued about $71 million in bonds, and that was to pay off a portion of our unfunded liability. At that time, you just sent the money to PERS and they took down your employer rates instantly. Side accounts were not a thing at that point. So our first bond just went into our system rates. Our annual payment, just to give you an idea, about $9 million in the current fiscal year. That's a rate of payroll we charge will be 4.5% in 24-25, and this bond will be paid off in 2028. And the rate will consistently continue to go down just slightly. We do have a reserve for this specific bond that we've used to smooth the rates over the years so that it doesn't jump up because the payment goes up, and so we wanted to make sure that we weren't jumping that rate all around for departments, but keeping it more consistent. The Employer Incentive Fund. So the state, in an effort to help the system funding of PERS, offered an incentive back right around the time of the pandemic, right before is when they started it, saying that if employers would put cash, not bonds, you couldn't go issue debt, but if you had cash to deposit and create a side account, they would match it 25%. So we definitely wanted to take advantage of that. So reserves, at that point, we had gone self-funded, which was going well for us with our rates, and our workers' comp claims were down, and so we had some extra reserves. So we were able to come up with the $10 million, where we got $2.5 million matched by the state and create our first side account, which offset our employer rate by 1.5%. We did choose a 10-year term at that time, and I'll show you a chart of why we chose 10 years based on what they were projecting about the system rates at that time. And then I mentioned 2022, we issued a bond of $286 million to pay off our unfunded liability at that time, and created our second side account, which started offsetting our rates at 16.8%. Now that offset varies throughout the term. I mean, this is a 20-year bond, this second one. It's going to depend on what the earnings look like. And so PERS adjusts it based on what that side account is earning, and they will do their best to make it last 20 years. So the rate could potentially be higher or lower, or the account, in some cases, could last more than 20 years if you had really good earnings. So we're just at the beginning of that and seeing how that's playing out for us, but that's where it started. And the PERS payment there is $17.3 million annually, and 2042 is when that will be paid off. Give you an idea of Lane County's PERS rates. There's a few buckets because we've done the bonds. So the employer rate for the different three groups that I mentioned ranges from 3.82 to 9.1, with the Tier 1, Tier 2 being the higher end of that, and the OPSERP General Service being the low end. Then we have the PERS bond rate I mentioned of 4.5%. We have that 6% contribution that is going into the IAP or being redirected to the EPSA. And then we have the newest bond rate, which is 16.87. So the amount of the percent of every payroll dollar, every wage dollar that is paid into PERS is between 31 and 36%. When I look at the whole employee population and where we're sitting in the different groups, our composite rate is right around 32.6%. I do want to note that there's one employee group, the prosecuting attorneys, that receive an additional 4% into the IAP account. That is something that they bargained. So here's the chart I mentioned on why we chose the 10-year for that first side account. This was a projection tool that I wanted to go out and update, but they've changed the tool so it doesn't quite give the data in this way. So this is back when we ran it in 2018. And so this was showing what the system rates were doing. So we did see the spike that's showing up there, that rates were going to get worse, and it was projected to spike in 21-23. It is still going up. So that we haven't hit the top yet, but it was then projected to really have a more steep decline when we get out to 35, 37. So the future, I mentioned that we got advisory rates. We received those. It was based on 2022 earnings, which were not good. So we're very hopeful that 2023 is going to be better because that's what our rates will actually be set on when we get them next biennium. And it was a much better year in 2023. But at that time, it did show our rates would continue to climb by as much as 6 percentage points. So we want that, that data to be better so our rates aren't quite as high. So that's all we had for you on PERS. Just giving an overview. Any questions?
I don't see any.
Okay. Thanks, James.
Thank you.
Took the bulk of that one, huh? All right. So we'll jump into the general fund overview and the initial forecast, which you did already have some information from Steve, but just a little more high-level stuff here is just again, referring back to what is the general fund. It's our primary operating fund of the county. It consists of the most discretionary revenues, as we've talked about, includes things like property tax, car rental tax, some federal timber receipts, and then some state shared revenue that's listed there. This is an area that funds a bulk of our public safety and places like elections and assessment and taxation. It covers between 25 and 30% of the FTE of the county. To give you an idea of the resources, we've mentioned property taxes quite a bit, and that's the top line there. Property taxes are projected to grow. The assessor has indicated 3.5% next fiscal year from current fiscal year, so that's the assumption that we've used. This is current year adopted numbers, so they will be different numbers for 24, 25. But you can see that of the total resources that the general fund has available in the current year adopted budget, property taxes were 48%. But if you look just at the continuing revenue that comes in every year, they're 78%. So very dependent on property tax revenue in the general fund. Where is that funding being spent? So on the expenditure side, The board is familiar with what we refer to as service option sheets. They're posted on our website, on our budget website, and they're talked about through budget committee. So that's the names that I'm referring to here when I talk about services. They're service sheets. The top 5 areas that we're spending it are shown there, law enforcement related, and then top 3 in general government and the top 3 in the public health and welfare. You can see that of the funding that is being spent in a year, 72, almost 73% of it goes to public safety, followed by general government and then public health and welfare. There's just a little sliver there of non-departmental. I can't even see if there's a point number there, maybe 0.66, okay. And that's things like our dues with the Association of Oregon Counties that we pay as a county, and so that's why it's not sitting within a department budget. The history of the general fund, which many of us are familiar with, but it is related to timber. Primarily, part of why our property tax rate is so low is because we did have so much timber revenue. And this goes back well over 100 years to the agreements that were put in place with the federal government, where the county received half of the timber receipts in the O&C timberland to fund the general fund specifically. We also received, if I'm not just talking about the general fund, we also receive from the U.S. Forest Service, and that's where you get the road fund piece of timber. But so as timber harvest revenue decreased and practices changed, we saw things from the federal government like something referred to as the OWL guarantee, where they gave us a certain amount every year. That was pre-Secure Rural Schools. And then in 2000, Secure Rural Schools was passed. The funds to help primarily the services like Sheriff's Office patrols, corrections, criminal prosecution, and then the pieces of public health and elections as well. So at the same time, as I mentioned, the harvest practices started changing. Then we also saw the property tax system be overhauled right around the same time frame. So the permanent property tax system that we deal with now and have was put into place through a couple different measures that were passed by voters. First in 1990, Measure 5 restricted the taxation levels for local government at $10 per thousand assessed value. And then in spring of 1997, voters passed Measure 50, which was a revision to a Measure 47, so you'll hear them referred to together a lot, Measure 47 and 50. It changed the system so that we had the permanent rates that we have today. So it was based on what governments had in place at that time, any local option levy that you happened to have, and if you had any kind of other rate, you put them together and came up with the permanent rate. Measure 50 also rolled back assessed values to 2 years prior that time, and it put the constitutional limits of how much you could grow. So assessed value growing 3% a year, plus any growth in housing. So new housing starts can be added to the tax roll, and that's how we get over the 3%. But otherwise, it locked in the growth rates. So the history of the budget, as we've talked about a little bit when we were talking about reserves, kind of what things looked like before. When we lost the timber revenue and property tax reform happened, there was a lot of use of one-time funds for operations, and it consistently meant budget and service reductions. We were a little bit up and down, up and down. Since 15-16, we've really focused on stabilizing spending, looking at that structural balance of the budget, not just a balance between resources and requirements, looking at spending one-time money versus spending one-time money on ongoing, focusing it only on one-time expenses, and really looking at where we could reduce expenses that we had control over. We mentioned the prepayment of debt, internal expense reviews, going to self-funded medical, and the things we've done around PERS. So the highlights of the forecast, this was mentioned on one of Steve's slides as well. The revenue growth projected for 24-25 for the general fund is about just over 2% growth. Ongoing expenditure growth is about 5.5%. I mentioned the property tax is projected to grow 3.5%. Other revenue growth is very modest. So we see most of those stay fairly flat year to year. Personnel expenses is projecting a 5% growth. That is using just current population of employees, assuming the merits that are already going to occur with their dates. It does not assume any COLAs or scale changes that have not already been approved by the Board of Commissioners. It initially assumes a 4% vacancy variance rate. We mentioned that we want to have a budget personnel number that indicates what we think we'll actually spend. So we watch that year to year. And there's a slight decrease. The first PERS bond that I mentioned that will be 4.5%, it's 5% in the current year, so it will continue to decrease just slightly over the next few years as we pay it off. So that's the one benefit rate there going down. Medical rate increase. While you heard what the costs are doing for medical, which is almost 12% growth, this is an area where, because we hold a reserve in the medical insurance fund and we manage it ourselves, we're able to use reserves to offset those increases. So we try and smooth the rates is the best way I can describe it to departments, so it's not as volatile. So the medical rate increase will be 7.5%. This, of course, means that fund is not structurally balanced, but we're managing it internally in order, again, to not have it be as volatile. Material and service growth. For the general fund, what the forecast assumes is what we see in the December Oregon Economic Forecast. They put out a CPI growth number, so we aim to hit that number in the general fund, which is 2.7 in their forecast. So this is what you already saw on the JAWS graph earlier, but just has the numbers associated with the revenue and expenditures, and right now projecting a structural deficit of $7 million. So I do want to also point out, and we highlighted the expanded patrol, that there are some places in the general fund where we are spending one-time expenses and we're using reserves. And the reason I highlight those is because some of these would not necessarily be considered one-time expenses and that the need would go away when the funding goes away. The first one being that expanded patrol. There was two different times, one of them involving the general fund. So there was $2 million set aside from the general fund by the board to fund some expanded patrol. And then there was additional from the road fund. And then there's another expanded patrol that was road fund only with Secure Rural Schools money. We have some staff, holiday farm fire recovery staff, that we're funding out of reserves. So the hope would be that eventually that need would end. But just to let you know, that's a place where we have staffing being paid for with reserves. We do have the ARPA funds and related expenditures. There are some positions that may not be a one-time need. So there's not a lot of positions that we funded with ARPA, but there's places where workload went up, and it's yet to be seen if the workload returns in any way or if we would need to continue those. The risk fund is paying for 2 FTE within county council right now. Those will transition to the indirect plan once we hit I think it's another year that they would have to be there. So an area where temporarily we're using the reserves in the risk fund. And there's a few limited in duration positions and one-time funding allocations out within departments. Then the most recent is the CCA, Community Corrections Act, Justice Reinvestment Funds, where there was a shortfall in the state funding, and the Board of Commissioners elected to direct general fund reserves to reduce the reduction. So there was still a reduction that occurred, but it was not as drastic. So we are keeping service levels within the Sheriff's Office and parole and probation at a higher level than we have ongoing revenue for. So those total about $5 million in 24-25. So it's a future caution that we will, reserves will eventually end. Overall, personnel expenses continue to outpace revenue growth, so that's the other caution that I would note. Reserves, I did want to include, yes, question?
It's an okay time to ask, and it might be as much a question for Steve Adams as for you. If you go back to the slide, the forecast cautions, some of these, and maybe all of them, we're working on, there's some legislative fixes that were those to fall into place and go our way would address them for us without, right? So for instance, the Justice Reinvestment Act and Community Corrections Act funding. Do you see anything else on there? I don't know, for instance, Holiday Farm Fire Recovery Staff, right, where that's time limited until there's another new need. Are there opportunities in legislation for dedicated funding from the state to fund positions for fire recovery? But basically, what up there, other than that final bullet, which I know we're working to address through funding formula fixes, do we see opportunity for legislative action to help us with our budget shortfalls?
Well, Chair Trieger, I would say on the Holiday Farm Fire Recovery, we do have federal community development block grant / disaster recovery funds rolling out at this point. It is possible that we could see some admin support for projects that will be ongoing, and we anticipate that will be probably a 2 or 3 year activity with respect to the spend, and probably a little bit longer. It's $422 million for the entirety of Oregon, and there's continues to be uncertainty with respect to how the state is allocating those dollars. Certainly, Commissioner Buck can speak to that. The CCA funding, we are on track for, I think, what the directors have recommended is a $16 million plus up to Community Corrections Act. In the short session, I believe my rough math is that would translate to about a 1.5 increase in the current biennium at the state level. And I think there's ongoing conversations, likely in the 2025 session, for addressing the formula more broadly, such that this isn't a need for a ongoing plus up. Further, I think DA Perlow could speak to this better than I can, but certainly the head count of folk within the system is increasing as well. And I believe that even the forecast for which the current biennium was pegged in terms of the head count at that point in time, we're above that of folk who are within the corrections system. So we anticipate that the funding within that going into the next biennium, I think it's reasonable to assume that even under current conditions, under current law and allocations, that we would see some additional resources coming in.
Thank you.
Okay. So reserves, this is a chart that I did not prepare for this. It is in our budget document. But because we're talking about the importance of reserves, and you've heard me refer to a couple of them, general fund, obviously, but also the medical fund, other places where we hold reserves for specific purposes. We identify the level of reserves within each fund. And then, as mentioned, the general fund is our discretionary general fund. The vast bulk of the rest of the funds have restrictions on that funding. And so we list what that restriction is. So I just want people to know that if you want to know more about the county's reserves, that's where you would find more information. And specific to the reserves levels, they mitigate our financial risks. So we have non-general fund reserves. They decrease the reliance on the general fund. So places like Road Fund having their own reserves, land management, which in many counties receives general fund, has its own reserves, parks, the places where they would have to look to the general fund, we want them to have their own reserves to be stable on their own merit. The benefit fund reserves help smooth the rate increase, which we're doing this year. And then the general fund reserve has given us time to achieve structural balance. Those of us that have been here long enough saw what happened when we spent reserves on operations. It was consistent reductions because we were spending more money than we were going to receive in future years. So it creates a much more volatile budget, and it creates an immediate need to fix it when you get a forecast that has a structural deficit. So by having reserves, it gives us the 2 to 3 years to come up with those solutions and see if some of the things might be temporary, so you don't have to react quite as fast. And of course, we have to have cash flow. Reduces our borrowing risk, so we receive better interest rates every time we issue a bond, and it provides us with the resilience to be able to do things like funding Holiday Farm Fire staff or any other emergency that comes up. We can say we can step in and help that service. It's the service and asset stabilization is what we refer to as those higher reserves.
Can I just make one comment before you move on? So that was one of the 35 funds. We're now going to dive into the other 34. No, we're not. But the natural question is, well, why did you only talk about one of the 35 funds? And the answer is, the general fund is the mothership, right? Yes, we have 35 funds, but the health of the rest of the funds is largely dependent on the health of the general fund. So, of course, the general fund helps support core fundamental public services like the sheriff's office, district attorney's office, assessment and taxation. I would say Mary Vuksich Schaefer would be here, if not for being out of town for work meetings. Elections, clerk's office, those core pieces. It also funds, helps support human services, public health, behavioral health, land management, parole and probation, youth services, animal services, right? So the tentacles of the general fund reach everywhere. That's why we end up focusing so much of the discussion on how do we create health, as much health as possible within the general fund, because the health of the general fund will create, inevitably, health or lack of health for the rest of the fund and the rest of the organization.
Okay, so we'll get a little bit into budget calendar and then what we're seeing as initial budget direction, just kind of next steps until you hear from us again when we come back to you with the budget committee. So as mentioned, we're here today. That's our leadership team kickoff. Next Tuesday, we will do a budget kickoff with our department staff. So that's when we will issue budget direction to them, and they will start preparing their budgets. Well, continue. Some of them takes planning way before this, but so February they will submit their department request budgets to the central budget office, and then meetings with the county administrator as the budget officer as he builds the proposed budget that he will submit to the budget committee. There's adjustments made during those March meetings, and then we prepare the document in April, and those budget committee meetings followed by adoption happens in June. So same type of time frame you have seen every year in recent years. So departments, I'll mention that the first thing departments in the general fund will do in particular is they will build what we refer to as an adjusted base budget. So they will build what is the current service level in the general fund at next year's projected costs and any revenue that's within their department at what they believe they will receive next year. So that is kind of a test of the forecast. We will see at that point what the true structural imbalance is once those are all entered. The county administrator will issue further budget direction to get to a balanced proposed budget and fix as much of the structural imbalance as possible. So some of the items that we expect to be as part of that direction are things like spending targets. We will be looking at reduction in cost requests, looking at analysis of other funding sources, efficiencies. We're also exploring a process for employee idea generation around efficiencies and expenditure savings that the county administrator might want to expand on. So for that initial budget direction, as I mentioned, the forecast and the budget that we have always prepared for the budget committee includes Board of Commissioner approved cost of living increases and wage increases, and we will include a vacancy variance, or at least consider it in all funds. So all funds have to identify what they believe they will actually spend in personnel in order for us to build in those vacant rates at the beginning of the budget process. The benefits, as we have already mentioned, medical rates will be the 7.5%, so we'll be using reserves there, and dental rates will be 0. On the material and services side, we do zero-based budgeting in the general fund and have for many years, so we ask departments to look and start from scratch on what they think things are going to cost in the next year. We do not just roll budgets forward, so continuing that. And additional focus in some specific areas. We're asking them to focus on equipment, things like cell phones, computers, as we've gone to remote work, what is needed for equipment, where does it exist, travel and training, printing, professional consulting and agency payments, and space, again, talking about the remote work, our buildings, our facilities, looking at leases and contracts. So we'll be asking our general fund departments in particular and some of our county-wide funds for some more detail on those pieces of the budget. And then our overall goals, structurally balancing our funds as is board policy wherever possible, or having plans to achieve that, continuing to meet reserve policies and using reserves where needed to stabilize, avoiding reductions in current service levels and making sure that we are in alignment with the strategic plan, looking at where we can enable resilience now and into the future, especially that last bullet being planned for the future stability. When this one-time money, we still have one-time COVID-related funds in our budget. When that ends, then ensuring that we have stability after that point.
What I'd like to do is just turn it over to commissioners and give you time to ask questions and wrap up the day here when you're ready.
Great. Thank you. Commissioners. Go ahead, Commissioner Seneca.
Well, and this might be to Mr. Adams again too, and Sheriff Harold. I'm getting a lot of questions about when that $2.8 million for our patrol funds is up in 26, I believe it said. Is there a possibility to continue funding that without getting into the reserves, or, you know, maybe Mr. Mokrajski, all of us? I mean, how does that look? I need to start answering that question because 26 is coming.
I'll say internally, we've already had conversations that during this budget process, we'll take a look at those two different board actions, initially for the 4 positions, 2 east, 2 west, and then subsequently with the SRS payment for those additional positions. So what we want to do is take a look internally. The board approved X number of dollars to provide this service for 5 years. We need to take a look at our projections. We projected at the time we'd need this many dollars to provide the service for 5 years. We need to take a look at our spend rate. Did we get personnel into the positions as quickly as we thought we would? Did we use the right salary level of employee to make the projection versus who we put into the position? And then be able to project for you, here's the remaining balance of what the board initially said we could use for 5 years, and how much farther can we make that stretch? We were pretty confident in our projections at the time, so I don't think we're going to find, oh great, we've got an extra year's worth in there that we could come to you and say, turns out we didn't spend all the money, but that's something that we're working on currently to be able to talk about at budget.
And can I just add to that you know, the board has expressed a desire to look at more permanent and long-term stable funding for public safety, and so we are in that process, as I reported to you on Tuesday, in working to finalize the appointments to the Public Safety Funding Task Force. That effort really is going to look at how do we create more stable ongoing funding, because this model of using this one-time SRS and general fund reserves to fund a 5-year, it's sort of like the public safety or any levy. You have to go every 5 years. You have to relook at it and find another. So it's not ideal. I think I would just add, I guess, that, you know, SRS funding, if we do receive additional SRS payments, that would be something to consider for the future. But ideally, we're trying to pivot from this place to a more stable, permanent funding beyond those 5 years.
Great. Commissioner Buck.
Thank you, Chair. So clearly, we've been able to look preliminarily at the general fund and its deficit that we know. Projecting forward, and I know we don't have the preliminary budget yet, but are you foreseeing, what other funds are you foreseeing that are going to have a structural deficit?
Well, some of the ones that I mentioned, land management, you know, Parks is in better shape because of the levy. So again, but then we have that 5 years, right? So now we're in this window of a 5 year, but Parks is in pretty solid shape operationally and deferred maintenance. And so we're working that plan. Land management, parole and probation. I would say youth services. There are a number of health and human service funds. Again, I mentioned public health, human services, behavioral health. Eve can talk more about behavioral health needs. Do you want to talk about
the public safety levy? You mentioned youth services, but that levy, because it relies on property taxes, which, as you heard, grow about 3.5%, and expenses are growing faster. So that fund is also in distress.
Thank you. Do Director Gray have any idea which in the H&HS funds you're seeing having a deficit?
Yep. The administrator spoke to our primary areas of concern. Human Services Division, you will hear more about at your next board meeting. We will be speaking to the one-time funds that are dwindling now, and we do not have as many funds coming in to replace them. So our division manager, Kate Budd, will be speaking to some strategies that we could use to determine how we decrease costs in that area, particularly that is one of our areas in Health and Human Services where materials and services is a bigger part of the budget than personnel, and that is because of agency payments. We fund a lot of nonprofits with pass-through dollars out of the Human Services Fund, so we'll be talking about that. And then public health and behavioral health, we continue to work with within those divisions to identify opportunities for us to achieve structural balance and or utilize other areas, revenue generating areas in the FQHC to help us. Strategically, the challenge is that when you grow in healthcare, you generally run at a loss for 2 years, and then you build the volumes that you need to have the excess revenues that you also need in order to fund the deficits. So we're going to be in that 2-year window right now. It's going to be pretty challenging for us to achieve structural balance within some of those areas, projecting a better pathway in the future once our growth in the CHCs has stabilized.
One comment I might make about those funds that really stood out to me in particular this time, looking at the funds that have become structurally imbalanced that maybe were okay a couple years ago. If you look at other counties, these funds would receive general fund support in other counties. So they really are very tied to the mothership of the general fund, and that's why they're struggling.
Thanks. Theme. Did you want to add something?
No, just to remind, well, Christine hit this point, but it's just important to know that when you see, like in the general fund and the impact on all these other distressed funds, the JAWS graph and the $7 million imbalance we're looking at for next year, right, that continues unless we do something structurally to continue to manage that, it doesn't assume a number of factors. And of course, we know we have 8 bargaining units in Lane County. It's a significant, every year we're bargaining with different groups that represent our employees to make sure that we're doing all the things that we talked about doing here to have a healthy and productive organization. We have not, because we don't factor in any growth in wages that are not already been agreed to. And so that's something just to keep in mind, that as we face these challenges here, we're also going to have other cost pressures that we haven't identified because we don't know what those will look like. That will then drive additional challenges. So I don't mean to make this is not an uplifting meeting, is it? It's not. I think what's good is we're talking about the challenges we have. We're focused, and we know the work that we have ahead of us. And we have great people at the table and around the organization and the community that are committed to doing this work. But the challenges are daunting in and of itself. And then there are things that we have not factored in that will cause additional pressure. So we have some this is all to say that we're headed into a bit of a storm and some big decisions and work to do. And it's going to take all of our effort and good thoughts.
Well, then I think I will just wrap us up if there's anybody else at the table that wants to provide any closing comment. Otherwise, I'll just wrap us up first by not just thanking everyone at the table, but our budget staff for getting everything prepared and all the support you provide, and everyone who came in the hall to watch and watching online. And I think, Steve, you said, it's not an uplifting meeting. I mean, depends on what uplifts you, right? But I think because we have the strength of this leadership team, because we have such strong support staff, because we have such phenomenal employees and folks who are all here with a shared mission in mind, I think we could see it as uplifting if we find meeting big challenges uplifting, which I think as Lane County we've shown that's what we do. So there's more to come. I think for me, as someone who served on budget committee years ago and is now in this role, one of the most important things we can do, I'm speaking to my colleagues in particular, is be those ambassadors out to the general community and help people understand why when we go out for things like levies, they matter. because I think of all the things general public doesn't understand is how restricted our funds are. So people wonder, well, why can't you just move money from here to there? If you say that's your priority area, why aren't you putting all your resources into it? And so just helping folks understand what government structure, what the challenges are before we even get into whether expenses are outstripping revenue or not. Just the structure that we work in is really important. So I don't know how many people in the general public would log on and watch a recording of this meeting, but it would be so instructive. I think it would be one of the best things we could do is encourage folks or go through and timestamp what we think are the juiciest bits to share out with the folks that trust us to give them good information so that we have the whole community behind us as we face this challenge, because that's the other thing I know we have at Lane County that's a strength, which is the broader community that we serve is engaged and is watching and does care and does have high expectations. So all of us doing our job to help them understand at least some of what we understand about the structural challenges will go a long way toward us succeeding in meeting them. So, so thank you, everyone. And with that, I will adjourn us until Tuesday, January 23rd, when we'll be back here for a Board of County Commissioner meeting. Thank you.